Hello, I'm Essie Fox, and welcome to episode 3 of Talking the Gothic. In the previous episode, along with Kate Griffin, I discussed the common tropes so often used when describing scenes of Gothic architecture, but we also touched on the ways in which animals can inhabit these narratives, perhaps reflecting emotions and desires to be found in their human counterparts, or giving feelings of unease because animals can be dangerous. They can be unpredictable. They might even symbolize a force of supernatural power. An example of this fear combined with the uncanny is plain to see in a painting by Henry Fuseli, which I've used to illustrate this episode. It shows a woman asleep, perhaps in sleep paralysis, while a demonic incubus is sitting squatting on her chest. Meanwhile, the two are overlooked by the apparition of a shadowy horse, literally a mare, the visual rendition of a nightmare. The sense of evil in this picture draws on the rawest of emotions, the sort of dread experienced by some people when they see a snake or spider or a rat. Phobic reactions such as screaming may seem to be hysterical, but perhaps there's an innate genetic memory at play. The dread of venom in bites, the spread of fatal disease, which may also explain why common Gothic imagery of damp and dusty cobweb rooms filled with the rustling of insects, the scratching claws of rats, or the snap and flutter of the wings of bats can make our skin prickle and crawl. Bats are mostly linked with the stories of vampires, but there are illustrations to be found in illuminated texts such as holy books and Bibles or catalogues of bestiaries depicting hellish demons sprouting leathery black wings, a sort of hybrid human monster. In a novel of my own, which is called The Fascination, one of the main characters is obsessed with such forms, and here I'll quote from the book. When alone, he takes his pen and sketches diagrams to show the ways in which one skeleton might be fused onto another. He recreates the mythic beasts he's read about in classics, especially the semi-hominids, half animal, half human. The group is vast with many subsets. Theropods are represented by the hoofed and goat-legged satyrs. Therocephalians have human bodies, but the heads of other creatures, such as the gods of ancient Egypt or the Minotaur of Greece. The Sphinx is an example of the set Anthrocephalus, a woman's features on the head of a muscular winged lion. Cephalothoros in verses might be depicted by a centaur, the head and torso of a man joined to a horse's lower parts. These fantastical creations are everywhere if one starts looking. Carved in the pillars of the church, and Theo strains his eyes against the sun's low slanting rays, even among the gargoyle parapets around the roofs of the house above him. Well, as well as hybrids of this type that inhabit classic myth, the god Zeus was not averse to taking on the form of beasts as an aid to his seductions. But there were also animals conjured up by fantasists that many ancient Greeks were convinced really did exist in the world of men, such as the unicorn, which was thought to populate the more exotic lands such as India. Somewhat later on in the medieval era, the white horse, or maybe goat with a horn like a narwhal's protruding from its head, symbolised everything considered as pure and divine, so much so that in tales of courtly love, it was only a virginal young girl who could ever hope to tame one. For those with tainted souls or bodies, a unicorn could be dangerous. It's benign, out of form, concealing a nature predictable, unpredictable, and wild, which in itself is a potent symbol of the Gothic, though it's generally more common for unicorns to appear in the fantasy genre, whereas demonic winged forms such as dragons or griffins do not seem at all out of place in tales of Gothic horror. Think of the old film, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, with its unnerving visuals of the cathedral's monstrous carvings, and I don't mean the Disney version here. And then there's Emily Bronte's atmospheric descriptions of Wuthering Heights, when Mr. Lockwood, the tenant of the nearby Thrushcross Grange, has travelled to the Heights to pay a visit on Heathcliff, and is surprised to find his landlord residing in a house that's rather grim and much exposed to the vagaries of weather. So excessive is the wind, and the trees that grow about the house are slanting and dwarfed, craving the light of any sun. And when about to pass the threshold and go on inside, Mr. Lockwood glances up and tells the reader what he sees. A quantity of grotesque carving lavished over the front, and especially above the principal door, above which, among a wilderness of crumbling griffins and shameless little boys, I detected the date 1500 and the name Hareton Earnshaw. Whatever story is foreshadowed by these carvings in the stones of Wuthering Heights, which is already hundreds of years old when the novel begins, Emily Bronte has immediately succeeded in evoking a sense of dislocation. Simply in this one display of griffins cavorting with a group of cherubs, we get a sense of something not quite right, a sense of evil, or the threat of corrupted innocence. But to return to animals existing in the real world, I'll mention rats again. Creatures that tend to roam at night, often in urban settings, where they're commonly linked to scenes of decay, whether that's resulted through extreme poverty or famine or war, or as the carriers of plague. One of the earliest references I can recall of rats in fiction is the Grimm brothers story, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, when the master seducer, with some supernatural power, plays his pipe to lure away a plague of rats from the town, but then turns his attention to its children when the adults try to cheat him of the fee that they had promised. Is this a reference to disease, perhaps some real life event that once occurred and killed the children, and now only survives in an allegory or fairy tale form? Well, one thing is all too clear. The presence of rats in this story result in panic and fear. They symbolise an underbelly that's normally kept hidden, and in Gothic literature, they play a vital part in many classic novels, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula or his Burial of Rats. In Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, Roderick Usher is convinced that rats are scurrying about in the house around him, just as they do in H.P. Lovecraft's The Rats in the Walls, in which the story's narrator has bought a house called Exham Priory, a medieval building with panelled walls and arching windows that he's recently restored before discovering the house was erected on the site of some ancient Druid stones. Beset by noises of howling from the countryside around, he's further tormented when he learns that his new home was once the scene of gruesome murders. Meanwhile, his cat is in a constant state of alarm, prowling about in search of rats, which the man is convinced are slithering behind the walls or using their claws to tear at rotting tapestries. Finally, driven to distraction, he follows the sounds down into the bowels of the house where, whether it's real or only a figment of his descent into madness, he finds human corpses in various states of decay and is moved to cry out, "God, those carrion black pits of sword-picked bones and open skulls of countless unhallowed centuries." This oppression of death, the eventual fate of every mortal on this earth, is also symbolized by ravens or crows that often live in graveyards, and that, in folklore, can act as messengers flying between the worlds of the living and the dead. In Edgar Allan Poe's ominous poem, The Raven, the constant tapping of the bird's beak against a window disturbs the grief and the despair of a man who's inside the house and who is mourning the death of the woman he has loved. As the poem carries on, he sees the raven as a prophet or the spirit of a devil, as it curses his pain while repeating, "Nevermore," as if it's taunting his loss, as if it's pecking at the sorrow of his heart while he thinks to himself, "And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted never more. Well, just as menacing to me are the depictions of monkeys in some Gothic literature. And I'm thinking of Poe again and his murders in the Rue Morgue. Or there's Green Tea by Le Fanu, or W. Jacobs' chilling tale, The Monkey's Paw, a haunting story which perhaps should be called Be Careful What You Wish For, about a mummified paw that grants its owners 3 wishes, but it's actually cursed because those wishes result in nightmare horrors that go on to overturn destiny, even raising the dead. Dogs, the animals often hailed as man's best friend, are also viewed as menacing in many folklore stories, such as the ghostly black dog that roams the wilds of Dartmoor in The Hound of the Baskervilles. But the black dog is also used to describe the heavy weight of clinical depression, when a mood of darkness literally dogs a victim. And thinking again of Wuthering Heights, dogs in this novel are symbolic of the characters who own them, such as the yapping little lap dogs that belong to the Lintons as they sit within the walls of the gilded Thrushcross Grange, as compared to the larger, growling animals that lurk in the shadows of the heights, creatures as wild and as untamed as Heathcliff and Cathy when they roam free upon the moors. Edith Wharton's Kerfuffle, published in 1916, is a short story that tells of a woman's pet dogs being slaughtered by her husband in an attempt to make her suffer, but which return as canine ghosts to seek revenge on the man and who now haunt the castle on one day of every year. In Stephen King's horror story Cujo, the lovable St. Bernard is bitten by a bat and infected with rabies, after which it becomes a savage murdering machine. But not so far removed from dogs, and often thought more dangerous, is their ancestor, the wolf, a creature that invokes a sense of wild independence, with the threat of aggression simmering below the surface. And what better illustration than the fairy tale story of Little Red Riding Hood, in which a child who's walking through the woods on the way to visit with her grandmother meets a wolf who persuades her to pick a bunch of flowers while it goes on ahead, eating the grandmother before it dresses in her clothes and then awaits the little girl while lying in the woman's bed. The girl arrives only to think how very odd grandmother looks, commenting on the sight of the wolf's enormous teeth, which are about to eat her too. Though in a happier version, a woodcutter arrives and finds the sated wolf deeply asleep in the bed, where it fails to wake up when the woodcutter slits its belly open with his axe, and then both the old woman and the little girl emerge alive, and as the animal continues to sleep, they fill its stomach with stones, and when it wakes and tries to flee, the weight of those stones causes the wolf to die, or, in yet another version, it tries to drink from a well, falling in and drowning. I could go on, there seem to be many other versions of this story, but the warnings remain consistent. The danger of strangers preying on the innocent, the older female sacrificed before the younger takes her place, the darkly sexual connotations, for the wolf in this form is nothing if not persuasive. This seductive quality is perfectly expressed in Angela Carter's collection of short stories called The Bloody Chamber, and in one of those stories, The Company of Wolves, Red Riding Hood's seduction by the wolf is firmly linked to the girl's puberty, blood in the form of menstruation being a scent that lures a man who is actually a werewolf to prey on her innocence and then threaten her with death. But when the two of them have sex, the victim turns the tables by renouncing her own species to become a werewolf herself, running off with her new love to join his pack in the woods. And now, with wolves and with woods in mind, I'd like to introduce you to the author Michael Stewart, a renowned Gothic scholar and creative writing tutor whose latest novel, Blackwood Women, features the last wolf in England. Michael, hello, and a very warm welcome to Talking the Gothic.
Oh, thank you, Essie. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really, really pleased to be on this fantastic podcast, so thank you.
Thank you so much. As an award-winning author, you've written 4 novels, 2 short story collections, and many plays for radio. But you're also the director of the Bronte Writing Centre, which is based at the Parsonage in Haworth, and which is where any aspiring or actual professional writers can join your courses and immerse themselves in the very world where the Brontes lived and worked, and all surrounded by the moors where they loved to walk. And in a book of your own, Walking the Invisible, you actually describe the countryside and the inspiration it gives to you when following in the Brontes' footsteps. And in your novel, Ill Will, you fictionalize the untold story of Heathcliff's life during the years after he leaves Wuthering Heights before he comes back again as a very wealthy man. If and when, and it's surely when, I make a podcast on the Brontes, I hope you'll talk to me again to discuss some of your theories. But today, with the theme of animals in Gothic worlds, I'd like to draw attention to the poems you've written in a collection called The Dogs, which is described in the blurb as touching upon the origin myths of dogs, how they have been viewed by different societies through the centuries, and how man co-opted dogs into everyday life. I wonder, could we start with you reading the poem that's called I Am Dog?
Yes, yeah, and thank you for that introduction. And to answer your question, yeah, I would love to come back and talk about the Brontes. But yeah, this is a poem called I Am a Dog. Once I was a god. I watched the wolf weep at my feet. The lamb offered me his fleece. Fish leaped from streams into my mouth and down my gullet. Figs fell from the trees like raindrops. Angels caressed my flesh. Demons slunk from my shadow. Children kneeled and prayed to me. Men and women offered me their bodies. Bishops gave me their souls. Kings asked me for mercy. The monkeys howled in the trees. The eagles tried to fly into the black pit of my mind. Then the lunatics built fires from their shackles, cut off their thumbs, gouged out their eyes, bit off their ears, and then they turned on me. Broke my back, cracked my ribs, twisted my hands into claws, tarred and furred me, crushed my skull, lolled my tongue, stretched my tail, sharpened my teeth. Now I am a dog.
That is such a moving, powerful poem. Honestly, I just feel shivers, even more so hearing you read it than when I read it on the page. Absolutely brilliant, Michael. And I know that you are a great dog lover and that you really have an affinity with dogs, but to take that further back to that sort of ancient, mythic aspect is brilliant. It's amazing to me that in one poem you've encapsulated so much the ancient mystery, the taming of spirits, and now in Blackwood Women, which is a historical Gothic horror novel, totally immersed in folklore and myth as well as reality. You inhabit the mind of a lone female wolf as she wanders through the darkness of a vast forest, and we see the world through her eyes. We feel her exhaustion and pain and her sense of loneliness after being separated from her pack and from her mate. And we can almost taste what meagre food she manages to scavenge because she's starving and hunting. And she's pregnant with what we sadly have to assume must be a doomed litter of pups, because at the time when this novel is set, which is the mid-17th century, this wolf, we know, is described as the last alive in England. And this is a real fact. And what I want to ask you now is what led to this extinction? And do you think the disappearance of the wolves is what makes them so mysterious to us now, existing as they do in a liminal state between the real history and dreams? And can you tell a little bit more about the law and the superstitions that surrounds these creatures, which in your novel, this is a noble creature. It's not like the one we find in Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I mean, the book, I should explain, has 3 different narratives and 3 different narrative voices, and it starts with the wolf, and it was originally actually called The Last Wolf. That was the original title for the novel. So the idea of the hunt for the last wolf was kind of where the book came from, really. And we don't know when the last wolf was hunted in England. We know when it was hunted in Scotland. We know Wales and Ireland. In Scotland, it wasn't until the last stage of the 18th century. So, the kind of stories and the myths about the last wolf in England being, killed in the sort of 16th century, I think it's much more likely that they went on to live into the 17th century. That's why I placed it there. And, in terms of why wolves were hunted into extinction, well, first of all, you'd have to say, well, globally, there was something called the Agrarian Revolution, the first one, the Neolithic Revolution, which happened about 12,000 years ago, when we turned from being hunter-gatherers to farmers. And that completely changed our relationship with nature. So wolves that were revered and were mentor figures and ally figures suddenly now become a threat. As soon as you enclose land and stop being in harmony with the land and start exploiting the land, your relationship with the land and with nature changes. So that's really the kind of first stage, I guess, in the persecution of wolves. And then if you look at this country, look at the British agricultural revolution that happened at the start of the 17th century and was marked by the first lot of enclosures acts where, the land is taken off us and is enclosed and exploited, and that's intensified throughout the 17th century up to present day. So the intensification of farming, really, I guess, is where the wolves were made extinct here in England in the 16th and 17th century. In terms of the wolf as a symbol, yeah, you're right. In my book, the wolf is a symbol. It's a wolf. It's a symbol for something that we've lost. And it's largely the wolf is seen in a positive way, but I guess wolves as a symbol have been used, negatively and positively, really, throughout literature, throughout culture.
Yeah.
You mentioned that we're writing good. There is that modern trope, isn't there, of the big bad wolf, and you've got things like the Navajo believe that wolves are associated with witchcraft. Lots of North American tribes, believe that coming into contact with a wolf would lead to mental illness and death. Wolves symbolize in narratives often, carnality, greed, wildness, madness, fierceness. But then there's all the positive stuff as well, that they symbolize wisdom, family, independence, self-reliance, intelligence, loyalty. And then you've got all the different global folklores, Turkic, Baltic, Slavic, Mongolian, Norse mythology. Odin, of course, is often depicted with two wolves, his loyal companions.
And then
so, and in Norse mythology, wolves are seen as symbols of chaos and destruction, as well as bravery and loyalty. So, there's so much there, really, when you look at symbology and the wolf.
Definitely, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, there's so much there if anybody wants to explore further into all those different traditions and myths, because it also just goes to show how many wolves there would have been, because obviously they played a huge part in human existence. And as you've said, the wolf in Blackwood Women, it's more of a noble beast. It's not cliched like the one in Little Red Riding Hood, but it's more of a victim of men, isn't it? It's that point when it is being hunted down. And it reflects the character of Cara, a young woman in your novel, and whose story totally mirrors that of the wolf. And could you perhaps tell us a little bit about Cara's backstory? Again, the real historical events, which you've described in a time as being bent out of shape.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole idea is that Cara and the she-wolf, they mirror each other, and their narratives alternate. They're both being hunted by the same men, in fact. So that's very much the intention of the book. In terms of the historical background and where Cara's come from, so Cara is the main protagonist. Her family are Irish. She is Irish, and the book starts with a prologue, I guess. Really, the book is set in 1649, but there's a prologue chapter where they're fleeing the Irish Rebellion of 1641. Her family are persecuted. They flee. The Irish Rebellion, people don't know, the leader, Phelim O'Neill, they planned this very sort of swift, very efficient coup d'etat. It didn't work out. It was very messy. It was very bloody. It led to the Irish Wars that went from then right the way through to 1653. It resulted in hundreds and thousands of people being massacred. So it was a very, very messy time in Ireland. But what happens in this book, which is set in 1649, is Cromwell Well, first of all, Charles I is executed in January of 1649. Cromwell becomes the acting head of state. But rather than kind of deal with this chaos that we're left in, he goes off to Ireland to settle scores. So he goes off to Ireland in the summer and massacres and enslaves thousands and thousands of Irish. And while he's away, it creates absolute anarchy and chaos. There is an uprising of lots of radical groups like the Levellers, the Diggers, the Ranters, the Fifth Monarchists, Quakers, and a group called the Family of Love, which came over from Germany, in fact, and is alluded to in this book. So, when Cromwell goes to Ireland, we really are left in a state of anarchy. There is a rump parliament, but it's not really effective. And that means, like with any chaos, with any anarchy, there is a certain class of people then exploiting that anarchy. So that's really the turmoil we're in, really, the setting of the book.
And it's a part of history that I know lots of people are aware of, but also lots of people aren't aware of it. And those memories run deep, don't they? And you've so vividly described the horrors of a time like that, but also the fact, I think what you've done really well is nothing is black and white. You've presented nearly every character that you describe, even the minor ones, in such a way that while you never excuse their dreadful acts, we do see them as real men. They're fully fleshed out. They are acting like animals or wolves because they're trapped by circumstance, with minds and bodies brutalized, which seems to leave them totally inured to the suffering of others as they sort of attempt to do their best to reclaim the common sense of their lives or the life they knew before, keeping themselves and their families as safe as possible in a world that is now anarchic and turned upside down on its head, which you, as you just so brilliantly expressed. But you do present us with another world, and that's very far removed from this anarchy of men, and that's the world of the forest, in which Cara eventually manages to flee. And there she's hunted and starving like the wolf, foraging for food. And the world around her, this woodland world, although, as I said, your book is steeped in reality, so I don't want to give people the wrong impression, but you also totally convincingly managed to evoke this sense of a sort of Gothic, dark woodland. With the bare branches of the trees like the skeletons of men from which fluttering rags look like the wings of demons. And you also convey the beauty. You can tell that you love nature and that your love of this comes through. You describe the bats and the nightjars flitting through the trees, and the badgers, foxes, rabbits, deer, and weasels, even beavers. And you also allude to the fact that beavers were about to be sent into extinction. And again, I presume that was all to do with, the fact that society was changing and beavers were a threat to what men were doing with the land. But in the maze of this natural world, Cara meets with another girl who at first we think, and you do this very convincingly, you sort of wrong foot us to a certain extent, because at first we're not sure if she's a vision or a ghost, but she turns out to be totally real, and she leads the desperate Cara through the treacherous or past the treacherous swamps and along the hidden paths of the forest to a secret camp where lots of women live. And you describe this at one point as a company of witches, which I really loved because for me that totally echoed Angela Carter's Company of Wolves. So tell us about these women. Are they really witches? And why are they hiding or living in the woods?
Well, thanks for all that. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you spotted the Angela Carter reference, by the way, because I love who are these women? Well, I suppose the short answer is they're persecuted women. They're women that are hunted by men, like the she-wolf in the book. They've been accused of witchcraft for a variety of reasons, cursing men who were cruel to them, having physical deformities, having conditions such as epilepsy, having a familiar animal, just hanging around with a cat could get you accused. One has learning difficulties, practicing herbal medicine, being Catholic. Cara is persecuted because she's Catholic, harming livestock. So these were actual real accusations. And I think there's 6 women in the coven, in the group, if you like. And I was trying to represent as much as I could within those 6, the variety of the kind of accusations of witchcraft. Whether they are witches is ambiguous, I think. And I wanted to keep that ambiguity for the reader to decide. And they are victims of male oppression, but really, in the woods they have agency. They're self-reliant.
Mm, mm.
This is a time, we've already alluded to the kind of chaos and the anarchy, but also this is the time when the witch hunter, it becomes so intensified. In
Yeah.
1649, this is when Matthew Hopkins is at his absolute zealous kind of height. And lots of men, not just Matthew Hopkins, lots of men appoint themselves as witch hunters. They don't have any qualifications. No one else appoints them. They just decide to do it themselves. They go from town to town. They torture, they imprison, they murder, mainly women, and make lots of money from it. So that's the kind of ambiguity. I guess Alice, who's leading the gang, she's kind of maybe a bit less ambiguous.
Well,
Um,
yeah, she is, isn't she? Because one thing that she does do when you talk about herbal, the knowledge of herbs and remedies or whatever, you also describe at one point she's taking or she ingests a brew made up of hallucinogenic mushrooms. I assume
yes,
it's mushrooms or it may be other plants. And then we have a point in the novel when she appears to leave her body lying lifeless on the ground while her soul rises up into the body of a raven. And of course, this is a bird that's often said to possess supernatural powers. And of particular importance in the plot of your book, it's a bird that in some folklore is said, well, in reality as well, but in folklore as well, to have an affinity with wolves. It can help wolves with hunting or whatever, but it also has a sort of psychic connection. And this notion that witches can take on the form of animals or had familiars, as you said, sometimes just a cat, um, could lead to them being hunted down and punished. And you've already alluded to that, but would you tell us a little bit more about the horrible tortures that they endured and what their ultimate fates might have been if these witch hunters actually did get hold of them?
yeah. Well, I mean, I should give some context really. So the witch trials were conducted really from the 15th century onwards to the 18th century. So it was a long period of our history, 300 years really. It resulted in the death of over 500 people. Most of them were women. I think something like 90% were female. But the most intense stage of that was the English Civil War, so from 1642 to 1651. And the most intense year was the year this book is set, 1649. And it really goes back to, well, lots of things. James the First, who was very superstitious and wrote his own witch hunter manual, demonology. Heinrich Kramer, who wrote Malleus Maleficarum in the back end of the 15th century. So this was a point where this was a global satanic accusation being made. All kind of evil in the world was being kind of attributed to this witchcraft phenomenon. In terms of what happened to the women and men as well, is they would have been stripped, they would have been examined, they were looking often for marks like a third nipple, or marks where the wolf, where Satan had bitten into them and turned them into witches. So they were looking for those things, and it could be anything. It could be a mole, it could be a freckle, anything like that. They were deprived of sleep. They were kept under surveillance to see if their familiars would appear. So if you're in a prison cell and a rat happens to scurry across, there's the evidence. They were tortured
You have a
until
scene describing that so well in the book. You really
yeah,
do.
yeah,
It's chilling.
yeah, and then they were tortured until they were. Although torture wasn't legal, they got round that really by things like sleep deprivation. So they were tortured until they were confessed. So they confessed, and then they would be tied. They would be swimmed in certain counties, not all
Mm,
counties.
mm.
If they sank, they would die. If they floated, then they were witches. So you couldn't really win. And then they were executed, mainly executed by hanging. There were one or two examples of being burnt at the stake, but most of them were executed by
Right,
hanging.
right. Actually, it's interesting what you say about the swimming. In my hometown of Leominster in Herefordshire, we still have the ducking stool that
Ah,
they
yeah,
used. It's in the church, which is rather ironic that something so horrible.
wow,
So it's still on display, and it's quite an enormous piece of machinery. With a great big piece of timber from the chair, which they just would plunge into the river. So horrific, really.
yeah.
Um, but anyway, getting back to your novel and the Company of Witches, um, their fates are entwined with the wolves, much as Kara's is. And we reach a really tense and thrilling climax in the book, which, I don't want to give anything away, but It coincides with the appearance of a notorious wolf hunter who you call the man from Gothenburg. And he's been employed to come and kill the wolf as an act of revenge for what one father believes has caused the death of his son. And I think I mentioned it. I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I found him so chilling. But also, I could just see him in a Hammer horror film. He is absolutely demonic. He seduces, he corrupts, he destroys with wild abandon. He obviously has a great charisma. He's also extremely wealthy from his hunting, very tall with golden hair. But he's no angel. He's a man. He's a devil in disguise. And he does remind me of what I mentioned earlier, the Pied Piper of Hamelin,
Mm,
you know,
mm.
luring the children away to some terrible, mystifying fate that we never quite know. And in your novel, this wolf hunter ends up causing a great deal more destruction than his paymaster ever dreamed of. So, without giving away the conclusion, could you tell us a little bit more about your inspiration for this extremely brilliant, chilling character and about wolf hunters in general?
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't, the Hammer horror thing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I grew up on those films, so it's bound to seep in somewhere. In terms of where Hellstorm comes from, I guess mainly in my imagination, really. I mean, it's not really based on any one particular, but the idea is that he's kind of half man, he's half myth. He is likened to lots of different animals: bats, spiders, sharks, wolves, in fact.
Mm.
I lived in Sweden for a short while with my then Swedish girlfriend many years ago, and I learned of the great wolf hunters in their history and the strong rituals, the traditions associated with wolf hunting. But he's really meant to be a trickster character, really, a bit of Loki, a bit of Odin, a bit
Yeah.
Nosferatu. He's an agent of chaos. And really the message I want to get across with Hellstrom is don't summon a power you can't control.
Yeah. And he
You know,
totally, he totally reflects the chaos of the time, doesn't he?
yeah,
Everything is completely swirling around and literally, it's like a dance macabre, isn't it? That
yeah,
you've
exactly. He is a personification of the general chaos in that world.
yeah. Well,
Yeah, and he's not immoral, he's amoral, or he certainly has morals we're not really sure what they are. He seems to have
absolutely.
a code of, I wouldn't even say ethics, but a code of conduct, which it's really baffling to us, I think.
I don't think he's such a gothic character, and I hope that our listeners today will be rushing off to buy Blackwood Women because they're going to have a great read if they do. I mean, I loved it. I loved it.
Thank you.
And it's a novel that basically, grips the reader by the hand, refuses to let go from the first page to the last. It's a unique work of fiction. It speaks to us on many levels, reality, Gothic, law, everything. And it has very strong messages of feminism and also about the horrors of war that, as we know today, they never really go away. The devil, in whatever form, is still walking. And ultimately, Blackwood Women pays an homage to the beauty of the world in all its natural living forms, with all the animals you describe, and just the beauty of the forest and the destruction, which is heartbreaking. And finally, to the ghosts of the wolves that actually remain to this day in our genetic memory. And now, I think, concluding on that note, but before we actually close, I'd like you to suggest something in the Gothic genre, a book or a film or a piece of music that might inspire our listeners.
Well, I'm going to read a short poem, if that's okay.
It's more than okay.
It's Emily Bronte's birthday today. It's the 30th of July. I'm not sure if this podcast will go out, today or tomorrow or whenever, but today is Emily Bronte's birthday. She will be 207. And I want to read one of her poems, which is probably not that well known. It's very much a Gothic poem. It's a strange poem. I don't understand this poem, but it hints at a dreadful, malevolent force, not dissimilar to someone like Hellstrom, really.
Mhm.
So if it's okay, I'll read the poem. It was written in 1839, so Emily had just turned 21, just after her 21st birthday, and it goes like this. The starry night shall tidings bring. Go out upon the breezy moor, watch for a bird with sable wing, and beak and talons dripping gore. Look not around, look not beneath, but mutely trace its airy way. Mark where it lights upon the heath. Then, wanderer, kneel thee down and pray. What fortune may await thee there, I will not and I dare not tell. But heaven is moved by fervent prayer, and God is mercy. Fare thee well.
Thank you, Michael. That's absolutely brilliant. It has been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast
Oh, thank
today.
you. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.